Hello, everybody. Hello, hello. You know what? I'm going to do a little introduction before we jump into that. What we're doing in this episode is that we are switching gears. I did 5 strategy sessions on election-related topics in the past few weeks, and they were all on the affirmative. Okay. So now I'm going to switch gears and we're going to do the negative on these ones. And the the negative is a little bit different than the affirmative. And a lot of people on the negative, they kind of treat it as if it is just its own standalone speech. Um, Keep in mind that the type of debate that we're doing right now is asynchronous debate. So that means that if you are on the negative of this, that means that you have the opportunity to research what your opponent said. You already have a speech from the affirmative. Okay, so asynchronous debate means you do one speech at a time. So the affirmative should have put out a 5-minute speech already, and that you need to answer that speech in one way or another. And so there are a number of different ways to do that. In the course that we offer, it has a number of different negative strategies. So the affirmative speech is like organized in a really sort of common and predictable way. You define terms, you offer a plan, you give some advantages. The negative has options. Okay. It depends. You have to adapt to what the affirmative speech said. So it's a little bit more difficult for me to give advice because it's not some sort of uniform piece of advice like on affirmatives. All right, you kind of modify your speech based on what the first affirmative said. And so in this episode, we're going to be going over a number of different arguments that you can make. Some of them are direct refutation to common arguments that other people make, but then there's also disadvantages to voter identification. But this entire episode is going to be about the opposition to implementing a new voter ID system. Okay, all right. We are going to be using ChatGPT for this, and here we go. Boom. You know what? I don't like that at all. We're going to be doing poo. There we go. Okay. I think I could even probably widen this out a little bit. So we're going to be using this because it's a really helpful thing. I've already done a little bit of it. I'll show you some of those as well. But let's just say that you have a speech that you're responding to. Somebody has already done an affirmative on why we should have uh, voter ID. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to get an example argument from an average debater, someone who's beginning. Okay, um, so there we go. I'm going to just copy that, and so I'm going to be using ChatGPT 4. It just gives so the reasoning factor, and so I'm just going to be doing refute this argument, like putting parentheses. I'm still not sure. Quotation marks. Still not sure if quotation marks are required for that one. We remove that time signature. I think there was a little error with the transcript. Okay, so look, it says that it limits any kind of fraud that could be committed against people in the past. So fraud is a major. Oh, if you can't read that, so this one argument is really it's not really organized, but it's like a very natural, common sense, intuitive argument. And so sometimes it's more difficult to address those types of arguments when they're not numbered, they don't have source citations, and it's just like people's opinions. I get a lot of students that get confused, like, what do I do in this situation when there's somebody who's just like giving their opinion on certain things? Well, let's see what ChatGPT suggests. Okay, So all I said was refute this argument, and I pasted in an argument from a transcript that I got from somebody else who is in favor of voter ID. Um, so a few things to understand if you can't read what it's pumping out right now. So what I want to illustrate on this one is what's known as 4-point refutation. I hope I'm not skipping too much. Please let me know if my signal is too choppy. Okay, so 4-point refutation. 4-point refutation means that you start by identifying your opponent's argument. And that's exactly what ChatGPT does very well. Okay, this argument claim it starts off by summarizing what your opponent's argument is. Now that's important because when you are the second person speaking, remember that this is only a section of somebody's speech, and technically this is at the end of their speech, right? You don't know that. You don't know that unless you were in the debate. And so once I tell you that, now it what it means is that uh, when you want to refute something, you have to summarize what you're refuting. You have to identify what exactly it is that you want to respond to. All right. And so this one says the argument claims that mandatory voter identification is necessary for limiting fraud, doesn't pose issues for minorities, and is consistent with other identification requirements. ChatGPT does a good job actually identifying 3 claims that is made in this one argument, which is also really common. So if you want to make your arguments better, stop slamming all of your ideas into like single sentences or single paragraphs. Separate those ideas. It makes it harder for people to address them, because if you make it seem like they're all the same argument, then one response would be fine. Okay, so let's take a look at some of the responses. So it says that it's for limiting fraud. Voter fraud is now, so 4-point refutation. That's the first point, right? Second point is you have to state what your competitive claim. That's what I like. That's the phrase that I like to do. You have to have a claim that competes with your opponent's claim. That you can't have both of them. There is a forced choice. So voter identification is necessary for limiting fraud. The response to that one is fraud is rare. Numerous studies have shown that voter fraud is exceedingly rare in the United States. Brennan Center for Justice has found that the rate of voter impersonation is between 0.0003% and 0.0025%. Therefore, implementing strict voter IDs laws to address virtually non-existent problem could be seen as unnecessary. Now, that's fine. So what that does is it really does call into question the the problem in and of itself. Now, why is that so important in debate? In debate, the first affirmative, especially on a policy topic, if you are advocating for a policy, you are supposed to address certain stock issues, things like harms or the problem, inherency or the cause of that problem, roughly, and solvency, an argument that your plan will solve those problems. So, what this is meant to do is that it's the result of decades, generations of people arguing about policies and patterns that they see in these debates. And one of the patterns is when people try to propose solutions and seek problems. All right. So you have a solution in search of a problem. And the reason why that's considered uh, like an inappropriate or a weak argument or an argument like that that deserves to be rejected is that what you're doing is you're giving power to people to make decisions based on their own sort of political philosophy, but not based on the reality of the world around them, right? It's like they have this solution and they're like, okay, where can I apply the solution? When could I do it? And it might seem like it kind of makes intuitive sense. It's like, oh yeah, I don't like fraud, and voter ID, I guess, kind of is supposed to prevent fraud. So I'm in favor of voter ID. But if you point out that there isn't this problem that you're talking about that needs solution, or the problem isn't significant enough to actually alter outcomes of elections, then any type of disadvantage, any type of disadvantage now becomes a reason for you to reject the policy. But also, but in and of itself, the harm, like not having harms, means that you don't have a stock issue. You don't have a complete case. You're exposing the fact that the affirmative is insufficient, and they don't deserve to win the debate round, let alone pass the policy. Okay, so you're pointing out a critical flaw when you're pointing out that there aren't the negative consequences. Okay, so voter fraud is rare, and this is numerous studies have shown that voter fraud is, and even cites. But what you have to do now is you have to go and you have to find the Brenton Center for Justice. And so what I'm going to do is I'm actually just going to take this stat right here because that is an incomplete source citation. I'm going to open up a new tab. I'm just going to search for those. See, notice how I'm searching for those stats specifically. Okay. So looking at the 2016 election, look at the facts. Okay, it brings up the Brennan Center resources. That resources might be good research reports. Yeah. So if you can't read the URL that I'm reading, it actually says research reports the um, in the URL itself. All right, Brennan Center for Justice. Here we go. Now I'm not seeing those stats that it pointed out. There it is. So, I don't want to cite this page. What I want to do is I want to click on this page. And now that takes me, but that takes me, look at that. 2007. 2007. That's a long time, people. It's like I mean, you got something that's 15 years old. We might need to update that. Okay. So this one is voter fraud in general. That's 15 years old. You might want something a little bit more. Here's 2016. 2016. So you see, when you look at it, look, the ChatGPT is putting out some really persuasive stats, right? Like that's perfect. Maybe I do include that, but at the same time, because I did a little extra research and I found the date of it, I am anticipating weaknesses that my opponent might be able to exploit. And so I want to I want to reinforce those weak areas with more recent stuff because I can see it coming. I can see it coming. It's like that was 15 years ago. We've had a lot of things happen since then. Voter fraud has become a major problem. It's like that was before all the claims of voter fraud were happening, and so that you could totally see how somebody might just dismiss that out of hand. But when you pile that up with other things that are more recent, all right, something within the last 7 years is yeah, it's getting a little bit um, long in the tooth, as they say, but it's not that old. You could now do um, a a search in things like okay, the dailies. So this is a database that is provided through the college I work for. Okay, so I'm going to do voter fraud. I'm just going to put it voter fraud in the U.S. Let's do that because we are talking about U.S. right? So search, boom, look, 2007 still, right? So the good thing about this one is if we want to do okay, we want to sort it. So we still are getting like 2017 um, as the most recent. Let's put the most recent first. The military's elite. Okay, I'm not sure if that's. This is about Ukraine, so maybe there's voter fraud in the Ukraine, or I don't know. But let's try to stick with as topical as possible. That's the problem with getting the most recent first, right? Is that it's not necessarily the most topical. Um, the Trump effect in the judiciary. Nah, Oh, that's a book review, it looks like. Like, it says nonfiction. Okay. I don't know if that's voter fraud or just, like, other fraud. Fact checking on his okay, so arraignment day. Okay, maybe that'll work, but, I mean, talk about Trump's arraignment, I'm not sure if I don't wanna get into that. What do we got here? Yeah, a lot of this stuff is Trump focused, which is kinda gonna happen. Um, this one, maybe the New York Times, Georgia, because Georgia was one of the locations where a lot of fraud was, allegedly, happening. Ridley Thomas, that's just LA specific. Dominion sues, maybe. Tax So what you're seeing here is that it takes it takes a lot of effort to study fraud. Like the method that you need to do in order to detect fraud takes like a design for that study, and it needs to be executed, and the data needs to be analyzed, and that takes years sometimes. So some of these ones that we are finding from where was I? Was it SPQ resources just on Google? You know, these Brennan Center ones, those might actually be the most recent. All right. And so go with it. Just say, like the most recent like studies of this are from around 5 years ago or so. And therefore, it found very little fraud, not enough to sway uh, an election. And so if somebody says, well, it's not more recent, it's kind of like, feel free, you can challenge your opponent. Feel free to offer your own more recent evidence that fraud is widespread now since this research happened. But I don't think that that's a logical conclusion to make. And we should only come to that conclusion if there is actual evidence of it. Otherwise, this is the most recent evidence that we have of voter fraud. And voter fraud is an incredibly rare and insignificant sort of effect on U.S. elections. Okay, now I think it's important that the fraud issue it becomes central in this debate because it's central in the debate, like in popular culture. Even if your opponent didn't make it a central issue, pointing out that advocates for voter ID all constantly reference fraud. But usually people are more about like voter confidence, right? It's kind of like, well, people think that there's fraud, even if there isn't. So this will solve that. All right. So let's move on to that. So to just attack the fraud argument, just jump up and down on it. There's so much evidence in your favor. What's the next argument? Okay. This is where I start disagreeing with ChatGPT. This next argument is disenfranchise of vulnerable populations. I don't consider this refutation. It is not a direct response to fraud. It is a separate disadvantage. So what do I mean by that? I'm going to zoom in on right here. Okay. The thing you got to realize about debate is that, especially on the negative, is that when you can refute what people are saying, but you can also make your own standalone arguments. Okay, so this is the difference between defense and offense. This is a really important distinction to make on when you're the negative. Defense means that you are trying to prevent your opponent from making points. People are really familiar with the term points when it comes to sports, right? It's kind of like they have a scoreboard and you put points on a scoreboard. Debate doesn't have a scoreboard necessarily, but we still use the term. That's a good point. Hey, you're making a great point. It's like my point is. So you can still kind of think about it that way, but now start thinking about arguments as points, right? And so in order for them to make a successful argument, they want to try to score points. If you say, nope, you didn't make that point, that's defense. If you want to make your own points, that's offense. So you want to score your own points and you want to prevent them. So defense is important, but offense is also really important. What I would do is I would suggest doing the this second one, disenfranchising vulnerable populations as your own disadvantage. How do you do that? So I'm going to now. Uh, Doing both of them are important. I'm going to show you why in a second. But let's just do this. Okay, make a quote disenfranchisement of vulnerable populations a stand-alone disadvantage. So now I'm going to specify how I want ChatGPT to organize it. Include uniqueness, link, internal link, and impacts. Have examples throughout. Okay, so uniqueness, link, internal link, and impacts. Those are the stock issues for disadvantages. Okay, so that's an important uh, sort of similarity to advantages. They have harms, inherency, solvency. These are uniqueness, link, and impact, or internal link and impacts. All right, and if you just tell ChatGPT to organize it that way, it's going to sort of scour all of its language models, and I promise you, it's in there. Okay, so here we go. We're going to scroll on down. I'll come back to the other responses in a little bit. But my point is, don't just take the results from ChatGPT and say, I'm done. Okay. Like this thing is 15 years old, but ChatGPT doesn't tell you that. This is not refutation. It is a disadvantage, but ChatGPT won't tell you that. Okay. So here we go. Let's go on down to all right, disenfranchisement of vulnerable populations. Here you go. So uniqueness, the first part, that is the current status of where we are right now. So notice how currently is the first word. So when you're saying a disadvantage, you have to set the scene. It's a tragic story that you're telling, and you're setting the scene. All right. So currently, many states in the United States do not have strict voter ID laws. Okay, cool. It might be nice to know which ones do. Okay, because then you can start challenging their solvency. This promotes an include. All right, so allowing eligible voters from various backgrounds to participate in the electoral process. It includes a democratic system that encourages participation from all citizens, depending on what state you're in. Right. So uniqueness is just about okay, what is the current status of U.S. elections and voter ID laws right now? Just kind of like giving a little background. Link. This is where you explain what the plan does. Implementing stricter voter IDs laws would create additional hurdles. Okay, this is where you can get a little bit more detail. You don't necessarily need to cite a source for this one. It might be a little bit more about like examples, but even then, you can still cite sources for that if you wanted to. And like not only that, but here, what are some examples of hurdles in the link story? All right, it would create for people to vote, especially vulnerable populations such as elderly, low-income individuals, and minorities. I'm like, what are some of those hurdles? Because that's also another argument that is common in the voter ID case, right? It's kind of like this is easy, anybody can do it, and you're like, okay, let's explore exactly what it might be. So I'm thinking the link is kind of light. It's short. It doesn't have enough detail. And so what I want to do is I want to get a bit more detail. And so I'm like, what are some of those hurdles? Um, Without proper identification, obtaining the required identification, limiting access to ID issuing offices. In some cases, ID issuing offices, maybe this one's good. I like this one. Maybe located far from where people live, have limited hours of operation, making it difficult for individuals to access transportation or inflexible work schedules. All right. Um, Which ID do you need to vote? This is a very common thing. You should check out like Texas as an example, right? Texas allows people with like NRA membership cards, like to use that for voter ID, but not school IDs, right? And like some people have rightly criticized that that is very politically motivated. So like choosing which, now if your opponent didn't specify which IDs, that's something that you can point out, is that that states will make it so that like preferred political affiliations, their IDs will be advocated over others, right? So military IDs might be accepted, but you know, things that aren't quite, like ACLU membership cards won't be, right? And so those decisions, if not clarified in the plan in and of itself, you can kind of exploit that certain states will use those vaguenesses in order to sort of like swing it their way. So elderly and disabled. I like this one. I would not bury it as the fourth thing that you put. Okay. Elderly and disabled individuals may face additional changes to, okay, disproportionate impact on, yeah. So elderly people have trouble locating original copies of birth certificates. That is usually a requirement no matter which identification you need. You need to have some sort of birth certificate. And if that birth certificate has any spelling errors on it, it makes it damn near impossible now. And pe- elderly people may have been voting for decades. And all of a sudden now they can't vote after being a citizen for life and voting all this time. And now all of a sudden it's like what you're doing is like, okay, there you go. Okay. Another thing, what's missing? What's missing from the disadvantage so far? So I wanted to add the link. But what's missing from the uniqueness is how many people don't have voter ID. So I'm going to go to my research right here. All right. So these are the major dailies. Let's see here. How many Americans lack identification? I'm going to change this one to relevance. I'm going to put voting on it just so I can maybe narrow down the results to something. Okay, that one's cool. That one's cool. That would be very helpful for the affirmative as well, right? Because then it makes it a little less political. Um, that one's. I want to read about the Native Americans turning the ID law into a gain, but I'm looking for something specific, right? Uh, that one. Okay, that might work. But I'm hoping I would like to just see a headline that's just a little bit more on point. So the dailies may not be as helpful as something like researcher, right? Um, just Americans without identification voting. I'm just putting in some keywords. Let's see what CQ researcher pops up. This is another database that is provided. So like all these different tabs are the databases that I have access to. You might have different access, like LexisNexis would be a great one for you to do. And sometimes it's just the best thing to do is do a Google search. How many Americans don't have? Okay, so ACLU oppose voter ID legislation. I'm like, okay, that headline. I'm like, I want something a little bit more of sort of news, like just report. All right, like just tell me how many. Um, Brennan Center again. So you're coming back. Look, 11% of eligible, as many as 11%. Uh, why doesn't America have a national ID card? Now, if your opponent proposed a national, some opponents do, some affirmatives, and I think that's a smart. I think that's strategic, very strategic. But look at this. This one has. This is NPR, a pretty like middle of the road um, news source, just the facts. Why millions of Americans don't have no government ID. It's about 10 years old, but uh, not seeing anything more recent. And the reasons why people don't have voter ID 10 years ago, I'm guessing, are going to be similar, if not the same, as to why they don't have them now. Okay. So I've come across this before, so I'm gonna jump on down to a section where it kind of really gets to like the heart of the matter. All right. So they're giving a lot of background. 31 states have introduced or tightened requirements in recent months. Okay. So God darn it. So if you're thinking to 11%, we have like we have over 300 million, like 330 million people in the United States. That would be uh, uh, that'd be a lot, right? I mean, like 33 million people don't have it. Holy moly. 11%. Holy moly. That would be crazy. Okay. Okay. So here's a good one um, where it gives you like a case in point. All right. That's a nice little phrase. Case in point. So when they talk about elderly voters and they don't have their birth certificate and like what's going on, here is an 84-year-old living in Wisconsin, um, and it is kind of a story that a lot of seniors have, right? Where never had a birth certificate, their names were incorrectly put on the documents, and they won't accept discrepancies between your birth certificate and other forms of ID, like social security card. So if your social security card has a different spelling of your name than your birth certificate, and they're like, nope, sorry, no ID for you. Okay. So Rethel Frank is her name. She had a baptismal certificate, and she tried to use that to get ID in order to vote, and they said, nope, sorry, that doesn't count. So when people say it's like, whoa, everybody has ID, it's kind of like, well, you do. I mean, but times have changed, right? And there's a lot of people that are alive that still don't have those particular types of ID. Maybe they lived in a city all their life, they never needed to drive. Okay, they don't travel, they don't need a passport, they've never left the country. There's lots of people like that, plenty of people like that. And she's been voting for years, and all of a sudden now she can't because somebody with like an ego says that they think we need to have voter ID in order to fight non-existent voter fraud. So this is a real person that really is not allowed to vote anymore in order to prevent fake fraud from happening. So now the question is like you have millions of people. How many of them are seniors in this situation? 1%? Is it 1%? Let's say it's 1% of, and let's say there's 11% of people don't have it. Where's the hold on, they put a number out here. All right. So the Brennan Center said 11%. 11% of 330 million people is like it's over 30 million people. So even if you had 1% of that, you're still talking about over 3 million people that don't have, it's like let's just say it's 1 million, right? And then 1% of those people are are elderly and in this situation. So you talk about 10,000 people already right there. Even if you take really, really conservative estimates of the people that you are disenfranchising, those numbers alone outweigh the numbers of fraud that you find. You are disenfranchising more people than you are preventing fraud. And that becomes the new criteria. You're like, listen, as the negative, I'm going to say that the disenfranchisement is going to be way worse than any sort of voter fraud, right? And so, if my opponent can prove that fraud happens more than the disenfranchisement we can count on from them, then uh, then they could win. But otherwise, I win because I just have more, right? Uh, they had a number in here. Millions of Americans don't have a government ID. See, and look, a lot of this was enacted because people didn't like the president that was elected. Like they reacted to Obama getting elected, and so 8 states are like, it must be because of fraud. And that was the only evidence they needed, right? And so that's what was motivating it, not because there was actual fraud being found, but because their favorite politician wasn't elected. Okay. And then it was kind of supercharged in this last election, right? So they say millions. All right. So you have people are very, it's very popular. Yeah. And the right to vote shouldn't come with barriers. Invisible.org. I don't know what the hell that is. Anyways, listen, so what you have here is some pretty good refutation first off, okay, for voter fraud, and then you have a disadvantage, okay. Now some people didn't go heavy on the voter fraud thing, they went with voter confidence, and so that's different. Like you can prove that there is low voter confidence, and so the in order to refute that one, what you want to do is you want to take a different approach to that one. In fact, let's take a look at what I said I was going to look at these other responses, right? So refute the argument. So we have disenfranchisement. So take out number two and make it into a disadvantage. False sense of security. So this one becomes a really good response to voter confidence. Some while voter may create a perception of increase, okay, some people might think so, but there's going to be plenty of other things that people can point to and still maintain very low confidence, like electric voting systems and foreign interference. So even if you do implement ID, people will just latch onto other things. It's not really that there is actual voter integrity issues. It's that people don't like the politicians that get elected, and they will find reasons on why we need to make changes and limit who is allowed to vote because they don't like the results. That's not going away. It doesn't matter if you have ID or not. What you can do is you can compare states with strict voter ID versus states without strict voter ID, and do they have more confidence? Is like, do people accept the results more often in those states? I don't know, but I doubt it. I doubt you can find that. All right, cost and resource. You could do cost. Yeah, I mean, especially if somebody has a national voter ID card, you could do cost, but I don't know if that's necessarily going to outweigh. Okay, so take a look. So this one is known as a solvency takeout or solvency refutation. This is a disadvantage, and this is refutation. This is a harms takeout. Right? So you have three different strategies. And now how do you lay them out? Well, in this particular case, I would start with your strongest argument. And I think that fraud is not a problem. Is not enough of a problem to enact restrictions on voting. Okay. So, and that would be a harms takeout. But then I would jump to the solvency. It's like, even if you have voter ID, that is not going to improve voter confidence. People are still going to find reasons to not trust in the outcome based solely on who gets elected, not how they get elected, who gets elected. They will come up with these stories about dead voters and undocumented voters that have no basis in evidence, no basis in research whatsoever, and they'll just believe it because it's convenient to believe it, not because it is true. And then I would do the disadvantage, where the disenfranchisement. Okay, remember, 4-point refutation means that you start with they said, and then you go I say, because. So the because is the evidence, and now you go down to therefore. So what I mean by therefore is, why is this important to the round? While the argument of mandatory vote may seem logical at first glance, it does not take into account to the rarity of voter fraud. But I would go beyond that. ChatGPT is not good enough in this situation. It says it does not take into account the rarity of voter fraud. Harms is a stock issue, a requirement in debate for you to have a complete first affirmative. The affirmative has failed at this requirement. You could vote against them for that reason alone. See, that's 4-point refutation. They say fraud. I say no fraud. Brennan Center backs me up. You don't have harms, therefore you lose. Got it? Then you go, they say that they say this will improve voter confidence. I say people will find reasons to not have confidence because find your evidence. You got to do your own research. You still have to do work. Okay. It's like, therefore, no solvency means no win for the affirmative. Vote for the opposition. And then you get into your disadvantage. See that? Two really good pieces of refutation. Hell, find multiple pieces of evidence. Say Brennan Center, ACLU, NPR. Like, you just list them. It's like there could be multiple reasons for doing it. And then when you get into the disadvantage, make sure that you have all the parts. If you see weaknesses, beef them up a little bit. Ask for a little bit more detail. Do your own research. ChatGPT is not a research tool. It is a brainstorming tool. All right. It is a writing tool, not a research tool. You still need to do your own research. Look on all the tabs. Um, I have ProQuest with all the dailies. I have JSTOR. I have CQ Researcher. I even have Google open, right? It's like, so ChatGPT is only one part of this system. So internally, these groups are less likely to possess required identification. Up to 25% of African Americans voting age do not have a government issued ID, compared with only 8% of white individuals. You could bring in the race component is really, I think, persuasive. Impact could lead to disproportionate decrease in voter among vulnerable populations. This erodes democracy. It marginalizes vulnerable groups. It decreases political engagement. Those are impacts. Look how long it would take to get through this entire, especially if you beef up the uniqueness with how many people don't have voter ID, and you beef up the link story as well, and you explain a little bit better. That will take at least 2 minutes to get through, if not longer. All right. And then you have 1 minute each for the disadvantage. I mean, you have a majority of your 6-minute speech filled in with just those 3 positions. And now add one more position. Find one more that you're, if you want to do the cost one, that becomes another thing that you can do. Throw in an attention getter with an introduction at the beginning, a little conclusion at the end, and you're good to go. Right? You got a 6-minute speech. It's really good. You're like, all right, I'm gonna respond to fraud. I'm gonna respond to solvency. I'm gonna have my disenfranchisement, disadvantage. Let's go. And you're good to go. You're good to go. All right. Listen, you got any questions about it? I would love to engage those questions. Leave some of those in the comments. All right. Let me know what you think. Anything that you oversaw. Maybe like some additional arguments that you might make in this situation. Okay. All right. Thank you, everybody. I will see you on the next one.